I keep the microphone close because the fog loves empty air. It listens better than any of us. If you've ever stood on a shoreline and watched the horizon swallow itself, you know how a thing can look whole one moment and not a thing the next. The fog did that to the world, not all at once, not like a curtain dropping, but like a patient hand pulling strands through an old sweater until the pattern unraveled. Places we used to count on, street corners, neighborhoods, the river bridge, became suggestions. We learned to live by suggestion. My name is Jonathan. I used to sell used books and teach kids how to underline the parts of a sentence that made their hearts beat faster. Today I log weather reports and ration counts, and the small, exact things that stop people from becoming stories told by others. I keep this record for the same reasons I keep this broadcast on the air, because there is sanctity in being heard, because one human voice calling into static still feels like a covenant. I am telling you this because sometimes, when the world feels like it is being edited out of existence, simply speaking keeps the shape of a person intact. We live around a radio tower they never finished. The skeleton of it, lattice and cable, flaking paint that might have once been white, thrusts like a cross into the low clouds. We call the settlement Beacon mostly because someone thought it would steady the others to say it out loud. Names do that. They pin things to the map of the imagination. Beacon sits on the edge of a harbor that now only remembers boats as ghosts. Salt hangs in the air and mixes with the smell of rust and wet cardboard. At night the fog presses against our tarps like a curious animal. There are about 30 of us in Beacon, sometimes fewer. People come and go, or they try to, and the fog decides. Our homes are plywood and layered fabrics, the windows permanently board-stilled. We ride the bones of cars turned into planters and fetch water from barrels. Someone got creative and wired a set of salvaged solar panels to a battered battery bank. We have light that works when the sun is not swallowed. Mostly, though, we navigate by memory and the rules. The rules arrived before we named them. At first they were whispers, old women muttering in the corner of a store, a teenager who refused to whistle while they laid a pallet across a window, and then the list grew teeth. They are short and crude and ceremonial, which makes them easy to remember when you are tired. Living by them feels like obeying the rights of people who'd seen worse and lived. We call them the rules because calling them anything softer, suggestions, preferences, feels like tempting fate. A few of them: never whistle after sunset. Never answer a voice that calls your name from outside the window. Keep all lights dim at night. No bright fires or white bulbs. Leave no food where it can be smelled without being seen. Never unbar the door just because someone you know says your name. You will hear me say them like I understand them. I do not. I only know the ledger of consequence, the small ledger of burned out eyes in a family's empty room. Rules in our world are distilled grief. Evelyn is our leader, though she chafes at the title. She has a way of folding practical kindness into commands, handing you a bowl as she explains why the bowl is the only thing that matters at that moment. Her hair was once shorter. She has since grown it long because it keeps her neck warm. Evelyn keeps schedule and ration and speaks to the radio tower like a friend who sometimes favors her and sometimes fools her. She survived the first month by being less sentimental than starvation demanded. And because she learned how to patch a closure in a roof with a scrap of sailcloth and an oath. When I tell you Evelyn is steady, I mean it in the way a tide is steady, inevitable and slow. Daniel is our muscle and our pragmatist. He can jury-rig anything and swears like a storm. He was a mechanic, which is not the kind of thing you list on a resume after the world ends. But if you want to keep a generator from coughing ash, trust Daniel. He has a small laugh and small regrets. He does not ask questions when people disappear unless there is something practical to be done. Folding the beds, tightening bolts, making sure the compost barrel is locked. He's the one who taught me which engines make good traps and which ones scream like animals when you wind them. Harper arrived 3 weeks after the fog thickened over the city like cotton. He walked into Beacon with a knapsack that looked too new and a bruise across one cheek shaped like a crescent. People were wary. Newcomers are always a question mark. Harper speaks quietly and observes too long for comfort. He told us a story about a road where the fog had taken someone whole and left the person's shoes on the pavement in a neat row, laced and empty. He said the shoes were still warm. I believed him because Harper speaks from the kind of memory that tastes like metal. We have others. Old men who know the river's sudden moods, teenagers who laugh too loud to be entirely sane, a woman named Salma who chants to the tomato seedlings and later swears she can hear the plants hum back at her. We have a baby, though she sleeps a lot and flinches a lot. Babies are both miracle and danger in Beacon. They make the rules easier to pass on and the decisions more exacting. The fog itself is no ordinary fog. It moves like an animal that both fancies and forgets its prey. It will let you see a street lamp 3 yards away and then make the lamppost vanish as if your eyes were lying. It carries sound in strange ways. A shout from down the block will arrive 2 minutes too late, like a letter delivered after the sender moved. Sometimes the fog holds voices, not echoes, exactly, but music lines and fragments of conversation. And when it releases them, it is always slightly wrong. A phrase will come back with the wrong name, a laughter that ends on a note that does not belong. Once, on the edge of Beacon, we found a radio transistor with needles of frost in its casing, and when I wound it, the music that came out was a child's nursery song sung in 2 pitches at once. It made my teeth ache. We learned the rules the only way you learn anything of consequence now, through test and expense. There was a man who loved to play harmonica. He would sit outside the ramshackle of our last shelter and play until the sun went down. He liked the way it made his hands look less tired. One evening he kept playing past the thin gold line where sunlight dies and the fog folded him like a page. We heard the harmonica stop, and we ran into the mist because the harmonica was family. We ran because we are human and there are things that ache us into action. We found him an hour later, pale, mouth full of something like paper, eyes heavy with the impression of having seen a neighbor he'd loved and then found empty. He would not speak of what he had seen, only that the harmonica sounded different to him now. He lived for 2 days and then slept without waking. After we buried him, we nailed up a sign that read, in plain block letters, "Never whistle after sunset." It felt cruel to leave instructions on a nail, but the nail was simpler than answers. I am careful not to recount tragedy as if it is mathematical. The ledger of loss in Beacon is not a story that adds up cleanly. People vanish in ways that make you insist they are still somewhere, that their names will be called and they will answer. The fog trades in those promises. It likes to puppet hope. Still, routine insulates us. Every morning we count cans like a church recites prayers. Beans, rice, sardines. We take turns on watch. A circle of 2-hour shifts where you stand and listen for the strange creak of something that sounds like a hinge but is not a hinge. We keep a small garden under layered glass. Tomatoes and small roots are a kind of religion here. Anything that grows is a miracle and a reminder that decay has not finished its work. Our radio broadcasts are the spine of Beacon. We keep a low-power transmitter alive, one of Daniel's miracles. And when I speak into it, I try to be both accountant and confidant. I read the ration list and the weather, and sometimes, when the hours are thin and the bottle of something warm is passed around, I read a scrap of a book I found, the first page of a novel about an island, or the beginning of a cookbook from better times. These small humanisms are what keep us from becoming animals that tell stories only of hunger. They remind us of syntax, sentences, and the idea that a life is not a list. The worst of the fog's tricks are the mimicings. The first time we encountered one, it was late and the fog had the appetite of a storm. Someone in Beacon, a woman named Marion, thought she heard her husband calling from the street. Her voice went soft and sweet, and she unfastened the bolt. She stepped into the mist and the fog swallowed her like a mouth taking in smoke. We ran after her, tools in hand and breath burning like iron, and found a scene that would unglue you. A figure, not Marion, stood in the road, hands full of trinkets and what's-his-name. The figure had Marion's jacket and spoke in an imitation of her voice that was near to the real thing. It had geometry wrong in its fingers. It is more terrifying to be lied to by love than by a stranger. The thing that stood where Marion would have stood beckoned and smiled, and then its eyes moved wrong, as if it was remembering something someone else had told it. We called to Marion, and she did not answer. Later, in the low light of the barracks, we found the jacket, a jacket with a name tag and the smell of home, hanging on a fence post. The fog had left her shoes neatly placed on the porch. We tried tracking, lights, and Daniel's traps. None of it gave us Marion back. Instead, it taught us new rules. There is a private politics to survival. You learn quickly who says what to whom, which promises our currency and which our paper in the rain. We hold meetings under the skeletal radio tower. We talk about scouting parties, about the ethics of taking in someone who can't give proof of where they came from. We talk about the baby and whether it is safer to stay in Beacon, or whether we should try to make it to the inland farms that, once, produced real wheat. Evelyn listens. She nods and then takes a breath like someone choosing the moment to break a bone carefully, deliberate. My backstory is one of small details. A wife I miss because her laugh is a physical ache. A son's baseball cap kept in a shoebox that I read the seams of like a scripture. I did not think much of maps or geographies until the fog erased them, but I kept, stubbornly, a collection of postcards I had never sent. People ask why I survived when others did not. Maybe it is a habit of being a librarian. You learn to preserve pieces and to make sure they are cataloged. Maybe it is because I can talk into a microphone without feeling entirely like a lunatic. Or maybe I simply have a body better suited to cold and hunger than most. The truth is probably all of it and none of it. When night comes in Beacon, it arrives slowly, like a decision. We dim the lamps. We tape paper over windows until the panes look like parchment. The fog thickens, a living scarf pressed to our faces. Voices in Beacon get smaller then. People speak in undertones. I sit in the radio room and sometimes pretend I am sending nothing more than an old man's weather report. In truth, I am sending reassurance like an offering. There are 3 cans of beans left on shelf. See, the baby slept through the night. Daniel fixed the pump. The rules are unchanged. I am telling you all this so that, when the rest of the story darkens, and it will, you will know the shape of where we started. Understanding the world matters less than the habit of understanding one another. This is the first chapter. The fog, the tower, the people, and the rules that keep us from unraveling. Outside in the damp, the fog moves again. A distant sound rises and then dies. Sometimes I think it is the sea arguing with the shore. Sometimes I think it is someone calling my name for reasons I should not trust. I will turn the microphone up a fraction and let you hear what it is like to be in a place where every sound is a question, and every silence an answer with teeth. I keep the microphone close because sound is the only geography I trust anymore. When I press my palm to the metal, the thing hums with a life that used to belong to other people. Technicians in neat shirts, radio hosts with canned laughter, weather anchors reading safe, numerical forecasts. Now it hums with the small, exact mercies of Beacon, the list of who ate, who stood watch, who woke up, and sometimes with things the fog gives us, half remembered and wrong. This is section 1, the first breath into the broadcast. I want you to feel the room with me. Picture a low-slung shack at the base of an unfinished radio tower. The window panes are cardboard stiff and taped in overlapping squares so the light comes in like pages in a book. A single bulb hangs from a wire, dimmed with a strip of cloth. There is a tin cup on the table with a ring of rust at its rim, 2 spiral notebooks, a pencil stub with only 5 usable inches left, and a battered transistor that Daniel managed to make sing again on a good day. The air smells of wet wool, old paper, boiled greens, and the metallic tang of an old wound left too close to salt. Behind me, the fog breathes against the building, at once patient and hungry. I begin, as I always begin, with these small, literal facts because facts are less treacherous than memory. There are 29 souls in Beacon tonight. The baby slept through the afternoon watch. We have 4 cans of peaches left and 6 jars of pickled beans. The tower's antenna bent in a wind 3 weeks ago. Daniel welded it back with a copper strip and a prayer. We have 2 batteries that hold charge if we do not ask them to do miracles. The rules are unchanged. When I say the rules, I speak of a litany that is both practical and sacred. It began as a list of do-nots and became a talisman. We trace it with our fingers like some people trace crosses. The first one is small sounding and enormous in its consequence. Never whistle after sunset. The words themselves are simple enough to fit on a scrap of cardboard, but they hold an economy of sacrifice in them. A life saved for every syllable obeyed. Why? I do not know the physics of it. I do not pretend to be a scientist. What I have are stories, witness accounts, and the ledger of consequences. There was a man, name was Tomas, who thought the fog would take more kindly to music. He played a harmonica as the sun died and the mist closed. We found him an hour later, eyes bright with a private thing he would not talk about, the harmonica slack in his hands like a betrayed animal. He lasted 2 days. After that we wrote the rule on a nail and placed it above the door where the rain might chew at it and degrade it into unreadability eventually. Even then, we speak the rule aloud before we leave the shack because speaking cashes it into being. I tell you this because rules in Beacon are not edicts of fear so much as memory with teeth. They are lessons carved into wood when carving lessons into flesh had a higher price than any of us could bear. We interpret them as best we can. We test them only when we are desperate or when someone among us believes themselves braver than the ledger of loss. Testing is expensive. I used to teach kids to underline the parts of a sentence that made their hearts quicken. I still underline now, but the sentences are people. I underline the way Evelyn fixes a tarp, or how Daniel's laugh comes out like a curse sharpened into a tool, or the way Harper stands at the edge of the group and studies the fog with the kind of attention that makes the rest of us uneasy. These are my annotations. I keep them in a notebook. I read them into the transmitter, and those pages are how we remember being human. Evelyn's hands work like someone who will not let a thing fail because failure left a scar on her own life that never healed. She organizes our turns on watch, our ration lists, and she is the one who says the most unbearable truths with a voice like tempered steel. She does not like the word leader. She prefers steward, a word that implies care, a daily tending. I will call her leader because language wants anchors, and she has the gravity to hold us. Daniel is less interested in labels. He is a mechanic with a laugh like a snapped cable. He has been up to his elbows in engines and blood, and has a belief that every problem is a machine waiting to be understood. That belief saves us more times than I care to recount. Daniel taught us how to make bear traps from alternators, how to seal a door with a garden hose when you have no sealant. Practicality is his religion. Harper is new enough that his adjectives derange the sentences in my head. He arrived with no story that fit our ledger. He showed up with a knapsack and a bruise on his cheek, a man who looked like someone who had been carved out of other people's misfortune. He does not talk much. He watches. Sometimes he walks away from Beacon and returns with nothing, sometimes with things that are useful and obscure, a tin of spices, a child's shoe, a compass without a needle. When he walked into Beacon the first time, he told a story of a road where shoes lay in a neat row, empty and warm. That image lodged in my chest like a foreign seed. There is a politics to rule-making in small communities. We debate and vote, and sometimes, in the lonely hour after the last watch, we bargain with the rules and with one another. Evelyn calls meetings under the skeleton of the tower. We sit on crates and we talk in undertones because the fog carries voice too well, and the wrong thing said at the wrong time is its favorite delicacy. We speak of scouting parties, of whether to risk the overpass to try and reach the inland farms that once produced wheat, of whether to take in a stranger who has no proof and too many scars. We speak of Marion and the jacket she left on the fence, and we lower our voices until telling the tale feels like apologizing to someone dead. In the first broadcast I ever made, back when I still believed someone out there might be listening from an intact city, I read a recipe from a cookbook I found in the ruins of a diner. I can still see the stains on that paper like a map of past hunger. People laughed on the other end of that broadcast and called out requests, and it felt like a civilization trickle. Now, most of the time, the transmitter folds my voice into static, and the fog takes whatever it wants. But the ritual remains. I speak because to speak keeps the outlines of a person. We hold on to grammar because it keeps us from dissolving into pure need. There is sound here that will rearrange your idea of safe noises. Dogs bark in the night, and the bark comes back from 3 streets over in a cadence that is wrong. Children's laughter, when it comes, rings at an angle that makes your bones ache. Sometimes the fog returns a voice with a name you want to hear. It will say, Jonathan, in a timbre almost identical to my son's, and for a breath the room becomes a home. Then the name will be followed by a sound like a hinge that does not match any hinge I have ever seen. The fog is a liar who loves the truth. We have methods to keep us from answering those lies. We close shutters. We disable lights that burn like beacons. We never ever open the door because a voice says our names. There are simple rituals. A coin on the windowsill, a string tied to a drawer, a whistle that is only used during daylight and never at night. These rituals are practical and superstitious at once. They are what our forebears left when their options were fewer than ours are now. Tonight, as my voice comes through the transmitter, I will read our list of necessities, the watch rotation, and then I will tell a small thing that happened. A boy named Omar found a jar of maraschino cherries, and we held a feast that lasted 20 minutes, because joy in thin doses keeps the rest of us from morphing into predators. I will say it as a small holiness. I will say the rules after like a prayer, because saying things aloud makes them harder for the fog to steal. I do this not because I am in control, far from it, but because telling a story is an act of defiance. When I describe the way Evelyn ties a knot, or how Daniel oils a hinge, I am insisting that there are more data points to my life than weather and starvation. I am cataloging not to prove anything scientific, but to prove that someone once existed and cared about the way the world looked before it folded into mist. I am, in a way, making evidence for ourselves. Listen, in the distance something moves and it sounds like the sea misreading the shore. My finger hovers over the little red light on the transmitter. I will keep talking. There is an economy to words in Beacon. Some are spent on gratitude, some saved for emergencies. Tonight we spend a little on both. I tell you about the peaches and the baby and the batteries because to catalog is to make a map for the future. Even maps that might be wrong are better than no map at all. When I sign off, for tonight or for an hour, I will say the rules aloud. It is a small liturgy. I will nail them to memory because memory is the only architecture left that the fog does not always disregard. And when I do, if you are out there and you hear me, know that there is a place called Beacon with a tower, 30 people, a baby, a rule about whistles, a man named Daniel who can make a generator sing, and a woman named Evelyn who ties the world together with a rope of practical truths. Know that we are imperfect and frightened and still enough in love with language to keep speaking. The streets of Beacon are not streets anymore. They are corridors of mist and memory, patched with planks, tarps, and whatever scraps we could find before the fog claimed the rest. Every morning I step outside and feel the damp press through my clothes, cold and demanding. I smell the salt, the wet wood, the faint trace of last night's fire still clinging to the air. Every sound is slowed, curved by the fog, and I have learned to listen to these distortions as carefully as any watchtower guard might scan a skyline. Beacon is organized in layers. At the core, under the skeleton of the radio tower, sit the communal shelters. Plywood shacks and canvas tents melded together into something resembling a village street. Some are larger, for families or shared rooms. Others are tiny cubicles where one person or two can curl into blankets and still breathe. We patch them together with scavenged nails, tarps, and hope, the latter being the most fragile and most necessary material. Outside the central circle, the gardens stretch in modest rows. Tomatoes, beans, and small roots grow under layered glass and fabric covers, absorbing every stray glimmer of sunlight before the fog swallows it again. The first rule of moving through Beacon is to never step unprepared. Paths are marked with string lines, rope tied between stakes, small bells hanging at intervals. They are both guidance and warning. The fog can erase landmarks in seconds, and the bells give away if something, or someone, is moving where they shouldn't. Every newcomer learns them quickly or does not stay. Harper learned on his first day, after stepping into a patch of mist that made him feel like the ground had disappeared. The fog presses against you, folds you into its world, and it is patient enough to let you panic before showing mercy. If it shows any at all, the people in Beacon live in a quiet tension that never fully dissipates. Evelyn walks among us like a steady current. She checks the gardens in the mornings, talks to the baby if she finds her awake, counts rations aloud so everyone can hear. Her presence is a compass. When she speaks, the fog does not listen, at least, not entirely. She keeps the rules clear and unshakable. Daniel moves differently. He doesn't speak often, but his hands tell the story of survival. Tightening screws, adjusting engines, oiling hinges, lifting heavy objects as if he were moving mountains that had settled into domestic shapes. He taught us how to repair the water pump using 2 broken pipes, a copper coil, and ingenuity. There is an art to it, a combination of understanding machines and predicting the fog's temperament. Harper is quiet, watching, studying the patterns. He often disappears for hours, sometimes into areas of Beacon that are thinly defended or frayed by fog. When he returns, he brings things sometimes useful, sometimes mysterious. One day he returned with a small, cracked mirror. He swore it reflected not only what was behind you, but also what the fog wanted to show. We laughed at first. Later, in the deep hours of night, I realized he had not been lying. The mirror did something, though I still cannot say what. Routine is what keeps us alive. Every morning begins with inspection, checking the barricades, counting food, listening to the wind's whispers through the twisted remnants of the town. The day passes in tasks, repairing walls, tending gardens, rationing and teaching those who remain how to move in harmony with the fog. Night is the dangerous stretch. Even with barricades, the fog can imitate voices, smells, and sounds in ways that make your mind betray you. We dim lights, tape windows, and never open doors at the call of a familiar voice. The rules, as arcane as they sometimes seem, are the scaffold of safety. Social dynamics in Beacon are complex. We are 30 people with histories, fears, and small resentments. Conflicts flare over trivial things, a misallocated ration, a question of scouting boundaries, a disagreement over who should keep watch. Yet under these minor eruptions lies the deeper understanding. No one can survive alone. Betrayal is fatal, yes, but trust, carefully placed, is just as critical. I have seen arguments dissolve into quiet cooperation, grudging nods, and shared meals under the canvas roofs. Evenings bring the broadcasts. I sit at the transmitter, low power, patched together from scavenged parts. I read inventory counts, announce watch rotations, and sometimes read scraps of texts or poetry I have rescued from the ruins. The act of speaking into the static is a ritual, a declaration that we exist, that life persists even as the world's edges blur. But the fog watches. Its movements are not random. It slips through gaps, presses against doors, carries sounds and whispers. Sometimes it offers illusions so perfect that the human mind is tempted to respond. A mother's voice calling her child, a friend laughing where there is none. The rules teach us restraint. Never answer a voice that calls your name from outside the window, the first lesson goes. We follow it not because it is polite, but because failure has measurable consequences. I observe the people of Beacon constantly, in part to maintain the ledger of memory, in part to catalog the variations in how humans respond to prolonged fear. Evelyn shows leadership not by commanding but by maintaining stability and presence. Daniel demonstrates pragmatism, mastering the mechanics of our survival. Harper, the outsider, challenges us to notice what we have stopped noticing, the subtle movements, the inconsistencies, the anomalies of the fog. Together, in imperfect harmony, we form a fragile system that can withstand some, but not all, of the fog's appetite. At night, the fog thickens and clings to the buildings like a living shroud. It folds over the walls, seeps through the smallest openings, and sometimes carries echoes of lost people. Sounds bend and stretch. A cough can be heard twice over and seem to come from a stranger or a friend. The smallest lapse can be fatal, yet the repetition of routine, the counting of cans, the maintenance of barricades, the adherence to rules becomes a kind of armor. And so we exist. In Beacon, each day is a ledger of survival, each night a test of faith in the unseen and the unknown. We mark time not by the sun, which the fog steals, but by the cycles of task and vigilance, by the rhythm of human effort and the occasional, haunting interruptions of the mist. I record this so you understand the world as we inhabit it. This is the settlement. This is the life inside the fog. These are the people who make it tolerable, if not entirely safe. And these are the first real lessons. The rules are born of consequence. Trust is born of observation. And hope, as fragile as it is the only thing that keeps Beacon from disappearing entirely into the mist. The first time we truly understood the cost of a rule, I remember it like a scar pressed to memory. It was early evening, the fog curling low over the roofs, muting even the familiar smells of wet wood and salt. Evelyn had sent Daniel and me to check the northern barricade. The air smelled of metal, wet canvas, and something faintly sweet, not sugar, something older decayed in the corners of the mist. We walked slowly, the string lines marking the safe path, our flashlights dimmed to amber glow. We had been told, but I think only in the hushed way humans tell each other about teeth, to never whistle after sunset. It seemed trivial at first, a superstition, a nice story to keep someone from whistling nervously. I laughed at it in my mind, a small, bitter chuckle. Daniel said nothing. Harper, who had joined us that day for observation, did not speak either, and then Tomas whistled. He had always had a harmonica tucked in his pocket, a little thing, scratched and weathered. He said it calmed him. He said the sound reminded him of rivers, of cities before the fog. I did not mind at first, but it was after the sun dipped fully below the horizon, after the last gold thread in the sky was swallowed, that Tomas lifted his harmonica and played. The fog seemed to pulse in response. It thickened unnaturally, swallowing our path in seconds, twisting the shadows of Beacon into angles that made our stomachs clench. I shouted for him to stop. Daniel lunged. Harper's eyes were wide, unblinking, as if he had already calculated the consequences. The harmonica sounded again, sweet and wrong. And then I saw it, a shape emerging, fluid, almost human. It moved with intention, bending the fog around it as it came. The first infected, or at least what we would come to know as infected. It was not a mindless thing. Its movements were precise, almost familiar. I caught a glint of eyes that recognized something, remembered something, not Tomas, not Daniel, but the echo of a life that had been. The harmonica fell silent. Tomas froze, I froze. The figure paused, tilted its head as though weighing a choice, then advanced. Daniel grabbed Tomas by the arm and pulled him back. The fog recoiled for a moment, then surged again, carrying the infected toward us. The shape mimicked human motion, replicated our gestures in a grotesque mirror. It did not speak, yet I felt its memory of language. It was a puzzle made flesh and mist. Tomas understood first. His face went pale, lips moving in silent apology. He remembered the rule, never whistle after sunset, and the weight of it hit him as the figure lunged. He pressed the harmonica to the ground and smashed it with a rock. The sound of breaking metal echoed like a gunshot, and the figure hesitated, recoiling, the fog around it quivering. We ran. Back to the barricade, to safety, to the familiar smell of beacons, tarps, and fires. Tomas would not speak for hours. He sat, shaking, while Evelyn checked the northern gate and counted breaths and hearts. That night, the rule was written onto a new scrap of wood and nailed above the shack entrance. It became clear then that rules were not superstitions. They were survival manuals written by those who had tested the world in blood and observation. Each rule carried weight, evidence of the fog's appetite and the infected's memory. We learned quickly. The rules were designed to preserve life, and ignorance of them was costly. We began to catalog them carefully, each tied to a lesson, a small ledger of consequence. Never answer a voice that calls your name from outside the window. Learned when Marion, a newcomer, stepped out into the fog because she thought she heard her husband. She never returned. Keep all lights dim at night. No bright fires or white bulbs. Learned when a cooking fire betrayed a scavenger team to the fog. Leave no food where it can be smelled without being seen. Learned when an old crate of beans disappeared, taken by something that mimicked the smell of human hunger and instinct alike. It became a system of checks and balances. Each action had a mirror in consequence. The fog and the infected were not predictable, but the rules were. They gave structure, a fragile lattice of logic in an otherwise chaotic and deceptive world. The infected themselves were unnerving in ways we had not anticipated. Unlike the monsters in stories, they retained fragments of what they had been. They could imitate voices, mimic movement, recall gestures, and sometimes linger near objects they had known in life. We found one later, crouched over a child's toy, rocking it slowly back and forth, murmuring a sound almost like a lullaby. We shot it without hesitation, but the memory in its eyes stayed with us, half human, half nightmare. From that day forward, every walk outside, every task in Beacon, was a negotiation with the fog. We moved in patterns designed to confuse it. We spoke only in low tones, and we enforced the rules with rigor. Each time someone questioned a rule, the ledger reminded us why we followed them. Human nature complicated things. Some doubted the rules, tempted to test them for their own understanding. Others, like me, insisted on rigid obedience, afraid of what the fog would take if we did not. Tensions arose between belief and practicality, fear and curiosity. Evelyn had to mediate, often by showing the consequences rather than explaining the logic. The rules are lessons, not suggestions. That sentence became our mantra, repeated aloud before the night watch, a daily confirmation that ignorance had a price. Harper, observing silently, started keeping his own notes. He sketched shapes in the fog, made diagrams of paths, tracked the movements of the infected. I think he was trying to understand them as one might study an animal or a storm. Patterns, signals, limits. His notes were obsessive, strange, and invaluable. They taught us to see the fog not just as a threat, but as a force with behaviors we could anticipate. By the end of that week, we were no longer merely surviving. We were learning, cataloging, adapting. Every rule followed, every mistake remembered became another stitch in the fragile armor of Beacon. The fog had teeth, the infected had memory, and humans had resolve. And I, speaking into the microphone, documented it all not just for ourselves, but for anyone who might listen, for anyone who might survive after us. The ledger of rules, the stories of first contact with the fog and infected, became the spine of our survival. The first real understanding of Beacon came in those days. The world had changed, yes, but we had not entirely lost the tools to navigate it. Knowledge, observation, memory, and adherence to the rules were the compass points. And for the first time, we glimpsed that there might be a way to coexist, not safely, not comfortably, but survivably, with what the fog had become. The journal appeared on a day when the fog had taken a kind of pause, as if it were considering letting us breathe. Harper returned from one of his excursions with a small, leather-bound book, the cover scuffed and corners frayed. He placed it on the table silently, as though introducing something alive to the room, and then stepped back into the shadows of the shack. I opened it first, the leather stiff under my fingers, and smelled the faint perfume of old paper and mold, the scent of history trapped and waiting. The pages were yellowed, handwritten in careful, looping script. The name at the top of the first page read, Marcus Reed, dated 10 years before the fog claimed the land. It was a record of the first settlers, a map of failures and small triumphs, a catalog of mistakes that had cost lives. Reed wrote of barricades built too hastily, of supplies left uncovered, of people who tried to reason with the fog and paid for it dearly. But there were also sketches, diagrams of shelters, notations about rules that sound familiar, never whistle after sunset, always cover light sources, trust the line markers. It was as though someone had known the fog before we did, had lived long enough to survive its first hunger, and had left a ledger for us to find. We gathered around the table in the dim light. Evelyn read aloud, her voice low, as if the journal itself might overhear and judge our comprehension. Daniel leaned over, tracing the sketches with his fingers. Harper just watched, silent and attentive, absorbing every detail. And I kept the microphone close, letting the static swallow my voice, recording the words for posterity. Reed's journal described the fog not only as a physical entity, but as something semi-sentient, responsive to human behavior. It had memory, he wrote. It could mimic, confuse, punish, and sometimes reward. Each rule had a reason, often a cruel one, and each punishment left a mark. One entry recounted a man who tried to leave a note outside the perimeter for another survivor. The fog carried it away, returning only the shredded paper and the memory of the man's voice in echoing screams. The lesson was clear. The fog does not tolerate deviation, not because it is evil, but because it remembers. Reading the journal changed something in Beacon. The rules were no longer abstract. They were codified survival strategies, etched by those who had failed and lived. Evelyn took it upon herself to create a master list, combining Reed's instructions with our own observations. We pinned it to the wall, each line highlighted, some scribbled with annotations. We began to treat it as a sacred text, not religious, but necessary. The journal also told stories of the infected, though Reed never called them that. He referred to them as echoes, fragments of people lost to the fog. Some retained skills, gestures, and patterns of memory. One entry detailed a craftsman who had wandered outside to fetch tools, only to return days later as an echo, still hammering invisible nails, murmuring orders to no one. The survivors learned to watch, observe, and never assume anything about these beings. They were neither alive nor fully dead, but something in between, a liminal danger that demanded respect and careful planning. Reading those pages, I understood that Beacon was not just a refuge. It was an experiment in continuity. The journal became a bridge between past and present. We began to implement strategies Reed had outlined, marking paths with bells and lines, rationing food to prevent waste and unwanted attention, and always communicating in hushed tones when outside the perimeter. We even began rehearsing emergency protocols, running drills for breaches or unexpected fog surges. But the journal also brought tension. Some of us, particularly the newcomers, were tempted to challenge the instructions, to test the boundaries of what the fog might allow. Harper would sometimes sketch deviations in his notebook, curious about outcomes. Daniel, pragmatic as always, was cautious but willing to explore controlled experiments. Evelyn, however, insisted on adherence. She reminded us that Reed's journal was the result of 10 years of lives lost. We were standing on the skeletons of those who had tested the fog and paid the price. And so we followed. We cataloged our own incidents alongside Reed's entries, comparing mistakes and minor victories. One night, I recorded an encounter where Harper, ignoring the line markers for a moment, stepped into a thin stretch of fog that shifted unnaturally around him. He froze, and a sound like a child crying echoed close to his ear. The rules had saved him. The strings and markers guided him back. We did not speak about it much, but every page of Reed's journal seemed to whisper, observe, remember, obey. The journal also revealed the human dimension behind the rules. Reed wrote of friendship, fear, sacrifice, and moral dilemmas. One entry described a woman who stayed behind to distract the echoes while others escaped. Another told of a man who refused to abandon a lost companion, paying with his life. The lessons were practical, yes, but also moral. Survival was not only about outlasting the fog, but about making choices that honored humanity in small ways, even when surrounded by inhumanity. Beacon changed after the journal. We became more methodical, more vigilant, more observant. Each of us carried it in some form, Evelyn in her leadership, Daniel in his mechanical adjustments, Harper in his silent sketches, and me in the words I spoke into the microphone. The rules had teeth, but now they had context. We understood that we were not just obeying to survive. We were inheriting strategies, learning from ghosts, and keeping alive the memory of those who had faced this apocalypse before us. And yet, mystery remained. Reed's journal did not explain everything. It hinted at something larger behind the fog, something purposeful. Certain passages described the echoes behaving in ways that suggested memory, curiosity, even a kind of malice shaped by recollection. Some entries were incomplete, pages missing, ink smudged as if the fog itself had intervened. Questions hovered in the corners of our minds. Why did the fog come? How did it learn? Was it possible to negotiate with it, or was compliance the only path? I read these words aloud into the transmitter that night, letting my voice tremble over the static. The fog pressed against the shack, listening. Harper sat beside me, tracing the letters in the journal with a careful finger, as if understanding them through touch might grant insight. Daniel stood by the door, tools in hand, listening for any anomaly in the muffled world outside. Evelyn closed her eyes, her posture rigid, absorbing every word and implication. Through the journal, we began to see the fog not as an amorphous threat, but as a system, a dangerous living system with patterns and limits. And with that knowledge came both hope and dread. Hope, because understanding gave us power. Dread, because the rules were exacting and mistakes carried consequences. The night the fog came in thicker than I had ever seen, we learned just how unforgiving the rules could be. It began with a faint whisper outside the barricades, almost melodic, curling through the cracks in the boards. At first, it sounded like the wind or a child humming, something benign enough that Daniel and I hesitated at the edge of the northern perimeter. Harper froze, eyes scanning the shifting mist, fingers tracing the outlines of his notebook, sketching patterns we had not yet understood. Evelyn's voice cut through the tension. "Stay inside the line markers. Do not respond." We obeyed. The whisper grew louder, closer, and for a moment I thought I recognized it. It was Marion's voice, soft, calling my name. She had vanished weeks ago, and the memory of her face, her laugh, the way she always adjusted her scarf in the morning made my stomach twist. Every instinct screamed to answer, to run, to reach into the fog and find her. But the rules were clear. Daniel gripped my arm. "It's not her," he said. "Not anymore. Remember the ledger." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat, and stayed still. The fog swirled around the barricades, dense and rolling, pressing against the walls of Beacon. Then the figure emerged. At first it was only a shadow, a dark smear within the white mist. But as it approached, I saw the outline of a person, hunched and jerking unnaturally, moving in fragments of memory. Its eyes, if I could call them that, flickered recognition and hunger, awareness and emptiness. It mimicked Marion's gestures perfectly, down to the tilt of her head and the sway of her coat. My stomach lurched. Harper whispered almost to himself, "It's an echo, not her but a memory of her." The rules had prepared us for this. We remained behind the barricades, lights dimmed to shadows, our movements deliberate and silent. Evelyn moved like a conductor, signaling us to positions with subtle gestures. The figure advanced, testing the walls, pressing against the weak points. We could see its hand through a crack in the boards, thin, pale, shaking. Then Tomas, foolishly or out of despair, leaned too far over a barricade to get a better look. The figure froze for a heartbeat, then lunged. Its motion was fast, precise, not random, but calculated. Tomas screamed. I lunged for his arm, yanking him back just as the figure recoiled. A sharp bang echoed Daniel had shot his rifle. The sound shattered the fog's illusion for a moment, and the figure retreated, dissolving back into the white haze. We counted breaths, hearts, and minutes. Tomas was shaken, pale, silent. The rules had saved his life, but the cost was etched in the tremor of his hands and the sudden hollowness in his eyes. We patched the barricade, rechecked every line marker, and whispered instructions until the first weak light of dawn bled through the mist. That encounter changed something fundamental. The rules were no longer theoretical lessons or vague warnings. They were protocols of life and death. And the echoes, the infected, were not simply threats. They were intelligent, shaped by memory, able to exploit hesitation, doubt, and human emotion. In the aftermath, tensions ran high. Harper argued for more aggressive reconnaissance, curious to map the fog's behavior, while Daniel insisted on caution. Evelyn mediated, balancing the hunger for knowledge against the cost of curiosity. I watched, recording, analyzing, and feeling the strain of leadership press against us all. Every action carried weight, every misstep a potential tragedy. We began to notice patterns in the infected's behavior. They mimicked human emotion, gestures, and speech selectively. Some followed the rules instinctively, avoiding light, respecting boundaries, retreating when a barricade was solid. Others probed relentlessly, learning, testing, adapting. We realized that mistakes would not go unnoticed. The fog, combined with the echoes, created a system that punished error and rewarded compliance. In the days that followed, Beacon adapted. We trained in silence, moving with precise steps, minimizing unnecessary communication, and always observing. Harper's sketches grew more intricate, showing paths, safe zones, and probable echo behaviors. Daniel devised traps and diversions to guide the infected away from the settlement. Evelyn enforced adherence to every rule with unwavering authority. And I documented, not just for survival, but to understand the psychology of fear, compliance, and human endurance under unrelenting threat. But survival came at a cost. That night left a scar on Tomas that never healed fully. His confidence shattered. He refused to move outside the inner circle without accompaniment. We all felt it, the vulnerability, the fragility of life in Beacon. Every decision became weighty. A misstep, a lapse in vigilance, a moment of hesitation could mean death. And yet, amidst the fear, there was an emerging understanding. The rules were not arbitrary. They were strategies honed by prior survivors, by Marcus Reed and those who had faced the fog before us. The echoes were not mindless. They were repositories of memory, fragments of humanity warped by whatever the fog had done to them. Compliance with the rules allowed us to navigate this liminal world not safely, but with purpose.